Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh. For the last 30 or 40 years, I have heard people crying out for the reform of the Ceylon Electricity Board. It is one of those institutions which people are generally not happy with for one reason or the other, and it has over the years proved to be something which has been somewhat of a stumbling block for our country's development. Either there's too little power being generated, or there are various faults which cause blackouts island-wide. There's a lot of corruption which has swirled around this institution, and generally a lot of inefficiencies. Now, the reforms have been proposed in many ways. Back in the early 90s, there was some degree of reform. There was the LECO, which was spun off, and there were, of course, other subsidiaries like Lanka Transformers, which were also spun off. But those reforms seemed to hit a brick wall, and the CB continued on its merry way. And the last government looked very seriously at unbundling the various aspects of the CB. But now we have a new Amendment Act, which there's a lot of controversy over whether it is heading in the right direction. And this, of course, is being taken up this week in Parliament. So to discuss all this and to broaden the discourse on this, I have with me Miss Yasmin Raji, who is the Deputy Manager of Research at the Advocata Institute, and she has delved in depth into the topic of reform of the CEB. Good evening and welcome, Yasmin.
Hi, Niresh. Thank you for the opportunity.
Right. So, Yasmin, let's take our viewers through the history of this. Now, there are several aspects to power supply. Would you like to tell our viewers about this? There is the generation, transmission, and so on. Can we start right there? Because that is what we are talking about in this unbundling, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I think firstly, I want to maybe clarify what really unbundling means. Unbundling refers to trying to separate the components that are potentially competitive from those that are, naturally monopolistic, right? So when you think of electricity and your electricity bill, or the, what you get, it's not just the bill of like supplying electricity to your household. It's also a reflection of, the cost of generating that electricity, transmitting that electricity, distributing that electricity from the main grid to maybe a regional grid in your area, and then all the way from the the supply entity to your homes, right? So it's so you have basically three essential components in the context of Sri Lanka, which is generation, transmission, and distribution. So unbundling would be that you're kind of instead of it being in this one single entity, which is what it is right now, right? With the CEB manages generation, transmission, distribution, and supply of electricity. So essentially, unbundling would mean separating these entities so that they are differently managed and that they are ring-fenced in a way that there's no conflicts of interest, that they can be managed separately for obvious reasons, that is for efficiency and productivity. So yeah, that is the general component. I guess, I wonder if this is the right time to come in and say why we're here today as well. It's because of this conversation of the amendment, right? In May 20, just about 2 months ago, the conversation of amending the Electricity Act that aimed to unbundle the electricity sector, which was sort of passed last year actually with the Electricity Act of number 36 2024. So there was there were amendments that were proposed in May 2025. So we're here to really discuss, is these amendments in the context of the structure of the the structure of the electricity industry, does it really make sense? Will it actually achieve the objectives of unbundling this industry for the greater good of this country?
Unbundling is not about privatization and selling off the assets of the state. It is about creating greater efficiency, isn't it?
Exactly.
And right now, I think everyone agrees that the CEB needs to be a lot more efficient because in terms of its human resources and in terms of the power wastage as well, because a lot of the systems and equipment are old. They often don't have sufficient resources, and although they do have an enormous number of people in their employment, but it's basically one of those entities, government entities, which needs reform, and we know this because there are other entities, of course, the CPC, Sri Lankan Airlines, the Railways Department, and so on. But the CEB in particular also plays a pivotal role in the finances of the country because it's such a huge entity that it affects the sovereign rating of the country, which right now is at near rock bottom. So we need to see some progress here, in the collective efforts to get our ratings up as well. So could you explain the financial aspect of it?
Sure. I think the financial aspect in itself would really sort of explain why the CEB needs to be reformed in the first place. Because a lot of the people, they don't really, when you say the CEB or any state-owned enterprise needs to be reformed, it's always sort of, faced and acknowledged with a little bit of fear about, okay, what does that really mean and things like that. But it really does cost us actually. I'll just take you through some of the reasons for why we think the CEB should be reformed, which we've detailed in our paper. Which is that, last year in 2024, this is after the crisis, we saw 2 downward tariff revisions, and then we saw that the CEB actually recorded a net profit of about 144 billion rupees. And that was in comparison to about 58 billion, I think, in 2023. Then after a 20% tariff reduction in the beginning of this year, we saw that the CEB actually posed a loss of about 18 billion in the first quarter of 2025 alone. So when you really look at these swings in profits and losses, it's not really to do with operational efficiency and inefficiency within the CEB. It's really more to do with the fact that there is this price setting methodology, right? It's based on, demand fluctuations. It's on a little bit of inaccuracies in forecasting due to obvious reasons, because of the weather patterns changing. You can't always predict that, right? So essentially, these profits and losses are mainly driven by tariff reductions, revisions, that kind of thing. But the CEB can't necessarily always rely on tariff revisions to maintain profitability, in the long run, right? Because if you look at how it has performed in the past, in order to sort of recover the losses that it has incurred because of this price setting methodology, what has happened is that, it's always the Treasury that has come in to keep the CEB afloat, right? So let me just give you a few examples. So back in 2000.
Let me just interrupt a little bit. It strikes me that the stability of tariffs, that is the rate at which we pay our electricity, that is a key component for businesses and especially for foreign investment. If you are going to change your electricity tariff several times a year by 20%, 30%, whatever, this is a huge cost component for a foreign investor. Whereas other countries which are also wooing the same investors would be saying, no, we'll give you this rate, this is it for the next year or 2 years or whatever, whereas we can't do that because of this issue with the CEB tariff structure.
Exactly, you're right, because electricity is a utility, it's an upstream industry, and there's several industries that depend on it. It's like a key input, right? So like if you think of the future, all of our, like we need to rely on a lot of export diversification as well for our future growth. And if you want investments to come in and set up factories here, we can't really be, having a very like the CEB as it is right now. In the long run, they're not going to really attract the right kinds of investments into this country because of the exact reasons that you said, right? So, I think maybe we'll just jump back into what I was saying earlier, which is the fact that in the past, whenever there's been losses that the CEB has made, it has always been the Treasury that has come in and sort of saved it or kept the CEB afloat. So, for example, in 2023, I believe the Treasury injected about 126 billion rupees into the CEB to settle some of its outstanding debts to the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation as well as to independent power producers, because sometimes it's also like something to do with the concept of circular debt, because sometimes the CEB buys fuel from the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation for as a loan basis, and they have to kind of repay them back at some point, but they don't have the money to repay them back. So then the Treasury comes in and sort of injects money, and it's almost like all of these SOEs, they sort of depend, like it's like that's the concept of circular debt is that so one SOE gets in debt because the other SOE doesn't repay them on time, things like that. So that's just one instance. And actually just this year as well, the cabinet was again approved another, it gave approval to settle the CEB's remaining legacy debt, estimated at about 182 billion rupees, somewhere around February this year. So we're seeing this constant, this Treasury coming in and stepping in to sort of save the CEB. So this money is not money that comes out of thin air. It is actually the taxpayers' money, right? So that in itself is one of the biggest reasons for why actually the CEB has impacts on public finances. It does have impacts on the economy in general. But
when you say 180 billion rupees, I'm just thinking that how many schools could be built, how many hospitals could be built. You could do a lot about transportation, roads, so on.
Exactly.
So these are, it's 180 billion, not million. So that's a lot of money.
Exactly.
Just to make sure that the CB can pay its own bills.
Exactly. And if you really look at even like this, like the way in which how public finances have performed, like if you look at in 2024 alone, we've seen capital expenditure actually dropping, because I think I was able, we come into this a little bit later in the paper, but after the crisis, we've put a lot of we've tried our very best to sort of put reforms in place to ensure that our public expenditures are kept at a low, because the very reason we got into this crisis is because of that, right? It's because of a lack of fiscal discipline, because we've borrowed more than that we can afford to even pay back. We've gone into all of that situations. So like if you look at our spending as well, it's mostly like it's a large component of it is recurrent spending, and that is also spending on some very essential things that you can't really cut back on costs for, things like interest payments, people's salaries, people's wages, subsidies. Those are the things that have really made up a lot of our recurrent expenses, whereas our capital expenditure, we've actually been cutting it back after the crisis because we simply cannot afford to actually take on more investments and more like putting in money into SOEs like the CEB anymore, right? So that's just one example. But actually, Niresh, more than even, yes, the finances is one issue, the fact that it drains finances of the public's finances, but there's also a lot of inefficiency that is attributed to the CEB in some of the decisions that it has actually made in the past. So, in our report, we've quoted a few that we've taken off from the newspapers itself. So, for example, there was an alleged reluctance to integrate cost cost-effective renewable energy and storage solutions, as well as the premature onboarding of LNG infrastructure without a real clear pricing or demand strategy in the past. I'm not talking about right now what's happening. I think there's but in a sense, in the past there have been decisions also that have been made because, and these decisions tend to really be taking place because you face no competitive pressure, right? You don't have another entity that's competing with you to generate electricity, with you to transmit electricity. So really the incentive to be more efficient in your decision making is also a lot less. So that is also actually part of the problem for why the CEB needs to be really looked at again to, in terms of reforms. So yeah.
Now, there is a new term for this, which is in vogue. It's not a new term really, but it's energy security. Because what it means is you can't wait until there's demand for electricity and then start building power stations. You have to forecast 5 years, 10 years down the road and build accordingly. And it's not just power stations. Now there's so many sources of power. There's wind power, solar, and so on. And you also have to look at your transmission network and all the other paraphernalia, as well as human resources, all that. And it's, Sri Lanka being right next to India, there is so much talk about the fact that India, with its massively accelerating growth, GDP growth, really needs more power. And Sri Lanka, with our wind power, I think hydro is pretty much taken up now, but solar power certainly, we've got a lot which, if we capitalize on it, we can actually export. Now this idea again is not new. I remember back when the Mahaweli projects were coming online, the J.R. Jayawardena government was talking about exporting power to India. But of course, with the war situation, all that, abruptly that discussion stopped. But now we're talking about it again. But once more, the CEB is now the stumbling block here, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because we may miss the bus here. India may decide, okay, they are building their own power stations, and because we here are not adapting fast enough. This doesn't mean that we should just jump into things, but there has to be a proper plan.
Exactly, yeah. So, I think we've highlighted the fact that I think you can't. Okay, so if you look at, you raised the reason, we have a lot of potential basically, but the real roadblock is that is the CEB equipped right now to put in the money that is required to, for example, if you take our transmission grid, to modernize it to the level that it can actually, allow transmission of electricity to, for example, a country like India, right? We don't really have the space for that. And actually, I'll take you through some of the reasons. What I'm trying to say here is that we have no room anymore for using our public's money to keep up and maintain our electricity system. We actually need to be looking for private capital in order to be able to, achieve some of those objectives and aspirations in like an energy secure future, to be able to even export energy. To be able to do that, the only way is to actually rely on capital, private capital. I'll tell you some of a few other reasons for why we actually have no space to rely on public, money at all. So, like I said, after the sovereign default, we've put a lot of reforms in place for all the good reasons, obviously. For example, with the Public Financial Management Act of 2024, there's a regulation to cap primary expenditure at about 13% of GDP. We also have things like the medium-term fiscal framework, where there's a target for only 2.3% of a primary surplus that we can maintain. That is for the medium term. So these are some of the things that we need to make sure that we're staying within and not sort of surpassing, because that's when we're moving towards the danger zone of again going to unsustainable practices.
Right. Basically, we cannot be borrowing willy-nilly anymore and just shoveling it to the CEB or any other state-owned enterprise. And certainly the corruption is now being minimized, hopefully. But we basically don't have access to the funding.
We don't. So, for example, again, another regulation, the Banking Act of 1988. So, in the Act, it says that whatever directive that is released by the central bank should be considered law. So, in 2024, the central bank, they released a directive saying where they kind of increased the single borrower limit, which is like if you take a domestic bank, it is the cap or the sort of extent that it can actually give credit to a single group of borrowers or a borrower, right? So they actually increased this limit in 2024 to about 25% for its tier 1. Then there's another percentage for its tier 2, but in aggregate only 55% can be sort of given in credit, right? That's what the directive says. So before the 2024 directive was released, there were certain exceptions, Niresh, that were given to national interest projects, national infrastructure projects, which the CEB and other SOEs could use as an exceptional gateway to get access to more funds from domestic banks, right? And commercial banks and things like that. The 2024 directive now actually says that that's not even allowed anymore. There is no exception now that is given for national infrastructure projects or projects for like the national interest. So the CEB can't even rely on those sort of means to actually get money from the domestic system.
Well, that's the reality because we went and broke the bank.
Yes, exactly.
In 2022, that's what we did.
Exactly.
All of a sudden, there was no money, no forex, and there were ships loaded with oil, which came and parked outside and then sailed away after a few days because we didn't have the money.
Exactly.
So we messed it all up completely, and now we can't be doing that anymore.
Yeah. So I want to say this example as well because I don't think a lot of people are aware of it. So if you take, for example, the Public Debt Management Act, which was another law that we passed in 2024, this law poses restrictions on the ability for the government to freely give treasury guarantees to SOEs, right? So, I mean, not only SOEs, but in general, the ability to give treasury guarantees. A treasury guarantee or a sovereign guarantee is like, it's almost like a letter that is given when, okay, let's take, for example, the CEB, and they want to get a loan from like an external bank, let's say, like an investment bank abroad or something like that, and they say, okay, we want to get this loan, and then the Treasury would give a letter saying, if the CEB doesn't repay this loan, we will give the money instead. So it's almost like a letter of support saying that we will cover this. So now with the Public Debt Management Act, the Treasury can't even just give it freely. In fact, the law actually says that, a guarantee will only be granted to entities that are not considered to be in financial distress. And how they determine this financial distress is that the Public Debt Management Office, which is something that was very recently established just last year, they will conduct a credit risk assessment. So of the entity. So if they take the CEB, they'll make the CEB undergo a credit risk assessment, and based on what this assessment says, they will price a credit risk, and they will charge a guarantee fee to reflect the risk that is borne by the government in giving the treasury guarantee. So actually, very recently there was a news report that came out that the CEB's request for just a $50 million loan from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that if it were backed by a government guarantee or treasury guarantee, that they would have to pay a 4.8% premium that is on top of the interest to the treasury to get that guarantee.
That's quite a lot.
Exactly. So it's very expensive.
That's what got our country into trouble in the first place. Now, I want to go into this issue of treasury guarantees in greater depth because this affects our country and our near future. But first we need to take a short commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back in a few minutes.
Chamatkara Ratriya, an enchanting night awaits. A tribute to timeless legends, a celebration of melodies that echo through generations. A heartfelt homage to two icons who defined the soundscape of a nation. Victor Ratnayaka and Priya Suryasena. Their songs shaped our stories. Their voices touched our souls.
Join us for a night of unforgettable performances by Nalin Pereira, Samita Mudunkotua, Sanka Dine, Raini Charuka, Nadimal Pereira, Lakshita Suryasena, Irushi Suryasena,
Chamatkara Ratriya, where legends live again. Musical direction by the brilliant Mahesh Nilipitiya. Every note will carry the soul of a legend. Mark your calendars for the 2nd of August from 6:30 p.m. onwards at the Muses College Auditorium. Tickets via theticketsministry.com. Don't miss the most heart-touching musical event of the year. Chamatkara Ratriya.
With your name, your unique talent, your phone number. To Sri Lanka's Got Talent PO Box 100 Ratmalana or WhatsApp us on 076 599 7788.
චමත්කාර රාත්‍රිය අගෝස්තු 2 වෙනිදා සවස 6:30ට අගනුවර මියුසියස් විද්‍යාලය රංගශාලාවේදී ප්‍රවේශ පත්‍ර ticketsministry.com.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Yasmin Raji, who is, of course, the Deputy Manager of Research at the Advocata Institute. Now, Yasmin, we were speaking about Treasury guarantees, and over the past few decades, these things have been handed out like party invitations, okay? The Treasury, under several regimes, to my knowledge, was simply guaranteeing things left and right, and some of these massive deals affected our sovereign rating. An example would be that massive corrupt deal of Sri Lankan Airlines with Airbus industry, which Airbus industry has said unequivocally in a French court that they bribed officials of 7 different airlines, including Sri Lankan. Massive deal, aircraft which we clearly didn't need, and guess what? In the end, didn't get the aircraft, ended up paying massive penalties. And there's a lot of litigation going on now, but this was all backed by our Treasury. So all this, these are huge amounts of money. And when you talk about Sri Lankan Airlines, when you talk about the CPC, if you were to talk about the railways, I mean, if they were going to buy, 100 new locomotives or something like that, these are massive amounts of money. So the CEB, everyone accepts that there has to be a significantly large investment to modernize it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Treasury is in no position now to guarantee much, is it?
Yeah. Actually, because I mean, we've established you cannot now rely on public money alone. People must be wondering, so then where are we going to get the money from, right? I think that there is a lot of opportunities out there. In our paper, we've just identified only one opportunity. I think everybody knows Sri Lanka's population is now slowly aging, right? And we may potentially see people who would be interested in long-term, secure, very low-risk types of investments. Because when people grow older, they look for that kind of a very steady stream of income is what they're sort of looking to be able to sustain a lifestyle after they retire, right? So electric utilities is actually one, I mean, all over the world, actually, it's seen to be one of those assets that, is the more preferred. They prefer to sort of invest in these kinds of assets in that sense, right? And it's not just Sri Lanka's sort of aging population that we can actually take advantage of. Even abroad, if the electricity sector is stable and we have actually achieved unbundling, and there are specific niche areas that private investors would be interested in investing in, we may even see private capital that is coming out from like EPF funds from outside. So I'll just give you an example. In South Africa, the South African Government Employees Pension Fund, which is the largest in the African continent as a whole, they hold at least 18% in a energy company called Sasol, which is like a major energy and chemical company that is involved in diversified electricity and hydrogen projects, right? So these are just examples that, it happens abroad. So I think that we should also aspire to sort of get there as well. So what I'm trying to say is that in us continuing to maintain the status quo, which is to not unbundle, because even though the current the new amendment is saying that we will have a separate company for generation, a separate company for distribution, a separate company for transmission, that we're not really seeing actually an unbundling in the sense that, would really attract the kind of private capital where we want to get into the country. So if you take, for example, with generation, with the original law, actually, what they suggested was to divide generation assets into different companies based on the generation asset. So there'll be a separate wind company, there'll be a separate hydropower company, a separate thermal company. So you would have for each specific generation asset a specialized entity that is going to be overseeing it. But with the amendment, what is being proposed is that, regardless of whatever this asset is, it's going to be one generation company. So if you think about it on a very logical sense, right, you will see in the future people are going to be interested in sort of investing in more clean energy, like renewable energy options. And we may, if this amendment goes through and we're actually going to be merging all of these assets under a single generation company, a private investor who would be more interested in investing in, say, renewable energy would not want to be really investing in the generation company that is going to be, established with this amendment, because of the fact that, that same company is also, having thermal, is also having coal and all of these assets. So where is the room, right? So if you do go ahead with the original act, which actually which actually separates all of these generation entities into separate companies, where there's very specific skill sets that are required to manage and run that generation entity, you will also see that, the chances of getting private capital, more special private capital that is meant for, those specific assets, I think the chances are higher, right? But you're actually essentially cancelling that off by, merging all of that into one generation company. So that's just one example that I can give you.
Right, and there's also, there are UN programs, ADB, World Bank programs, which basically will fund clean energy.
Exactly.
That's
you don't need to look very far. Yeah.
Exactly. So if the same company which is doing coal says, could you fund our wind generation? They might, World Bank may hypothetically turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, you don't qualify because you're not clean energy enough.
Exactly.
So, we need to think of all those aspects as well. And so basically what you're saying is the unbundling has to be done in the optimal manner.
Exactly.
Looking at why we are unbundling. It's not just unbundling just to say, okay, we've unbundled now into
not for the
three
sake of
or
it.
whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
But now, unbundling does not mean that you're just selling off the companies. That's not it.
Yeah.
That would be a much bigger decision, which obviously the government would have to take if it wants to do that. So no one's actually proposing selling off the CEB because that brings, a different lot of issues as in who's going to own it, national security issues, and so on. So that's not it. It's not about handing it over to the private sector or another country's government or private sector or anything like that. It is simply about optimizing efficiency.
You're right,
isn't it?
Niresh. Actually, so I think with this amendment, I think we can frankly say that you can very well see that the way that the amendment has been proposed, I gave you the example of how the generation, the original, what the Act said about generation, and then what the amendment said about merging it under 100% state control, all of these generation assets. If you take, for example, even the transmission, the original law said that the government had to own only 51% of the transmission license provider. But with the amendment, it's 100% ownership, right? And the same case with even the distribution entities of the CEB. So the original act said that they would divide the four divisions under the CEB into 4 separate companies, which would allow private investments to come in. And then with the new amendment, it is one distribution company, which is again 100% state ownership. So there is this, I think it is driven by, we think that it is driven by this fear that inviting private capital in, inviting the private sector would necessarily mean letting go of the government's or the state's, national interest and giving it to the private sector. There is this fear that actually comes out of it, but there is actually a way to think about this. It's not, like you said, it's not about selling it off. There is multiple examples in the world over where the government has still been able to maintain, protect national interest, but still, invite the private sector to be involved in the whole electricity generation, transmission, and distribution process, and in essence have a more optimal industry, right? So if you take, for example, the transmission aspects of the CEB, so like I mentioned, now it's the proposed amendment is saying 100%, right? Like 100% state ownership. But I'll just give you an example of how it works in Argentina. So in Argentina, there's about 7 transmission companies. And the largest company that, essentially oversees the national grid is a company called Transina. And that company, so what the government did was they gave the national grid to Transina on a 95-year concession contract. So even when they gave it on a 95-year concession contract, it wasn't for a continuous period of 95 years. They actually broke it to about one initial 15-year term, and then after that consecutively 10-year terms. So what happens in that process, Niresh, is that they essentially at the end of each period. So for example, if you take the first 15 years when that company took over, at the end of that 15 years, the concession was re-auctioned via seal bid, and then the incumbent operator would participate. They would retain control of the national grid only if it submitted the highest franchise bid. And if not, they would lose the concession and be compensated with the winning bid amount. So this structure, the way it operates, you can see that actually it is not a question of who owns it, but also it's about how you regulate that asset actually. So if you have the correct type of regulation and the correct contracting, you can actually involve the private sector in without necessarily selling things off. You can do it with a public-private partnership model, and like in the case of Argentina, you have through concession contracts, you can have a private sector entity managing the transmission grid, and on a periodic basis, when there is that incentive for when you know that you have to rebid, you wouldn't do anything in that period that would cause you to not get the bid again, if that makes sense, right? So you wouldn't
run it very well.
Exactly. You wouldn't hold the grid hostage, and all these things that people are very fearful about. It wouldn't really happen, right? Like if the contract is structured well, so obviously for all of this, you need a very good regulator. You need predictability, you need skilled people who will know how to do the contracting. You will need all of that, right? So what I'm essentially trying to say is that there is no need for fear here, right? If we have the proper regulations in place, we can still involve the private sector. I'll give you another example with New Zealand, actually. So this is more of a generation kind of example. So in New Zealand, what we see is that there's about 4 generation companies, and of these 4, there's about, I think 3 of them have like a mixed ownership model where the New Zealand government owns majority stake, and then there's another private generation company as well. So I mean, they all coexist within the same environment, right? So I think somewhere, I mean, this is just one example. So in 2004, the New Zealand government felt that they needed to sort of increase the generation capacity. So what they did was they commissioned a 155 megawatt oil field reserve power plant somewhere on Hawke's Bay to provide backup generation during periods of low hydro inflows or major plant failures. So in that instance, Niresh, the plant was actually state owned, but they contracted this private company called Contact Energy to install and operate it. So in these countries, you can see that there are clearly public-private partnership models in place. So the government can, okay, let's take the amendment, and now they're saying it has to be 100% state-owned. Fine. Even if the state wants to own the generation assets, they can, but then they at least need to get separate entities to manage it.
Right.
So you can, what we're saying is, don't make it one generation company where all of these different generation assets are under one company. You divide it into separate generation companies. You will have a very specialized entity that will manage that generation asset in the most optimal way. So the government can still maintain stakes on it, like it can own it, but you just give it to a private entity to manage it. So there are different models. So I would say people who sort of think that, unbundling and restructuring CEB is about selling it off to the private sector, they really got it wrong, actually, because you have ample evidence out there that it doesn't necessarily have to be like that.
But there's also our experience with partial privatization, where during the 90s, under the Premadasa, Wijetunga and Kumaratunga governments, we had partial privatizations. We had I think Sri Lanka Telecom was one of the largest ones. Sri Lankan Airlines at the time was also partially privatized, and some of these companies were, basically the government kept the majority share, and then some of them were, a portion of it was actually listed on the stock exchange, which allowed the public to trade, to make money off it. And also it was a fortune for the employees, the staff, because I think in the case of Telecom and Sri Lankan Airlines and many other such institutions, the staff were gifted shares according to their seniority in the corporation, and also I think their level, whether they were a manager or an executive or whatever. So there was a formula for this, and many of these people who had let's say worked 10 years, 20 years in these corporations, they made fortunes out of it, because soon as it was listed on the stock exchange, they waited for the right price, they sold, and lived happily ever after, basically. So it's good for the employees as well. So you don't have to sort of sell the whole thing. That brings about a lot of questions. Who's going to buy it? Who is it? Which minister is involved? Is there corruption and so on? But if it's a proper process with partial privatization, I mean, maybe just 20% being partially privatized, or 30 or 40, the government still has the majority of shares, which means the majority of directors on the board.
Exactly. I mean, I think if we even we don't need to go to telecom and all of that. We can even look within our own electricity industry, the example of LECO actually. So, I mean, again, I'll just highlight just for everybody listening here, the original law said that we'll have 4 distribution companies. The CEB's divisions would be divided into 4 distribution companies. But then the amendment says that there'll be only one distribution company that will also be merging the functions of LECO, right? So I mean, if you look at LECO right now, when you compare it against the CEB divisions and how they perform, although LECO does it does operate in a very smaller area compared to the rest of the CEB divisions, it has, in terms of efficiency, and because of its corporate governance model, even though it's a publicly owned entity, even though it's owned by the CEB, because of its corporate governance model and its independence, they've actually shown a lot more innovation in the way that they deliver their services, in how they distribute electricity. You can see the differences in the performances. I mean, my household gets its electricity from the CEB, but I know friends who've gotten it from LECO, and I think a lot of them are a lot more happier with the services. I mean, they don't get like a paper bill. They get everything like it's now all like e-billing, right? And like I think the
CEB has also moved to e-billing in many areas.
Okay. So maybe it's like now gradually rolling out. But the first to do it was actually LECO, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, that's just one example. But in several areas, LECO is obviously a lot more, in terms of performance-wise, it is actually a lot better. So when you sort of say that you're also absorbing LECO into like this distribution company, you're killing the kind of like competitive pressures that has seen the result and the success of LECO. You're sort of not allowing that kind of thing to happen when you put all of these divisions under one company, right? So I would say, just imagine like the original law would most likely have given us 4 LECOs. I mean, you can imagine the kind of innovation and productivity.
All owned by the state.
Well, the original law said it would be private. But in this case, even if it was 100% state-owned, if they were independent entities, they would have competitive pressures with the fact that there's several distribution companies. That in itself is like incentive to have to perform better in terms of efficiency, in innovation, in service delivery. And you'd actually see the productive gains out of that a lot better, rather than it being under one company alone, right? So we don't have to look too far. LECO is honestly like a great example for us to look at. So that's pretty much what we have to say on that.
So we certainly have a lot to think about as Parliament ponders this amendment, which is before it right now, before the House. I'm afraid, Yasmin, that we are out of time. I know there's a lot more to discuss on this, but we have to give way to the news, which is coming up next. My thanks to Yasmin Raji, Deputy Manager Research at the Advocata Institute. Delighted to have you this evening on the show.
Thank you, Niresh. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah.
And thank you to you at home for watching. The news is coming up in a few minutes, so have a great evening.